share the planet with animals.
One more time.
We share the planet with animals.
That's right. We share the planet with dogs, cats, and birds, and snakes, and honeybees, and lobsters, and coyotes, and crocodiles, and camels, and jellyfish, and snails, and grizzly bears, and mountain lions. And that's why us storytellers really love to tell stories that have animals in them. Would you like to hear one of those stories?
Yeah.
Okay. Then when I say crick, you say crack. Crick is an old-fashioned storyteller's call. It's me saying to you, are you ready to listen to a story? And when you answer crack, that's you saying to me, you've got our attention. We're ready to listen. Let's give it a try. Crick.
Crack.
Crick.
Crack.
Crick.
Crack.
All right. Now, I want to start by telling you an old fairy tale from the beautiful country of Scotland, and I need your help with this story. When I give you a signal, I want you to cheer with a lot of energy and a lot of enthusiasm. Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray for Jack. Let's give it a try. Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray for Jack. All right. Crick.
Crack.
Once upon a time, there were three brothers named Bill, Tom, and
Jack.
Now, Bill was a strong brother. He was always showing off his muscles and pushing people around. Tom liked to go shopping and spend money. And Jack liked to hang out in the backyard with the animals. So his brothers were always making fun of him and calling him dummy. Even though Jack was a really kind-hearted and friendly young man, he never ever got any respect from his brothers. But their lives changed one day when their father, the king, started getting really, really, really old. His hair turned white. His beard grew all the way down to the ground. You could hear his bones creaking when he snuck into the kitchen at night to get some hot chocolate. And he knew that it was time to choose one of his sons to start running the kingdom. But he wasn't sure which one would do the best job. So he decided to have a little contest. He said to his sons, boys, we're going to have a little contest. I'm sending you on a long journey to find the most amazing tablecloth in the whole wide world. And the one who can do that gets to be king. And I want you back home in 1 year and 1 day. And then the king, he took his sons up to the roof of the house, and he reached down into his pocket. And do you know what he took out of his pocket? He took out 3 snow white feathers. And he gave those feathers to his sons. He gave 1 feather to Bill. He gave 1 feather to Tom. He gave 1 feather to Jack. He said, boys, these feathers are full of magic power. Magic power. See what happens when you throw the feathers to the wind and follow them on your journey. Just see what happens. And so Bill threw out his feather. Whoosh! And it sailed away to the east. Tom threw out his feather. Whoosh! And it sailed away to the west. Jack threw out his feather. Whoosh! it floated into the backyard. The older brothers laughed at Jack. They said, "Hey, dummy, I guess you won't be going very far on your journey." And then Bill strapped on his guns, sharpened his swords. Tom took 32 bags of gold out of the safe. They said goodbye to their father, and they followed their feathers, one to the east, the other to the west. And Jack packed up a year's supply of peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, and he went into the backyard to be with his animal friends. Well, a year later, Jack was sharing his food with a family of squirrels when all at once this little frog, just about the size of my hand, hopped right up to Jack, pulled on his jacket. He said, "Hurry up, Jack. It's time to win the contest." And the frog took Jack over to this great big rock, and he knocked 3 times on the rock. You can knock with me. Bam! That rock just split wide open. And there was this long tunnel underneath the rock. And the two of them, the frog and Jack, they made their way down that tunnel, deeper and deeper until they got to the bottom. And do you know what was at the bottom of that tunnel? There was this huge room, and it was just packed with, what do you think? Who said tablecloths? Good guess, but not the right one. It was just packed from one end to the other end with frogs. Hundreds and hundreds of frogs. And they got so excited when they saw Jack, they jumped up and down and they cheered, "Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray for Jack!" And right in the middle of the room, there was this huge throne, and it was shaped just like a mushroom. And sitting on top of that throne, there was a great big bullfrog. He was the king of the frog. That bullfrog was 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, with beautiful black spots and emerald green eyes. And he said, "Welcome, Jack. Welcome to our kingdom. What do you need for the contest?" Jack said, "Well, I could use a
Tablecloth.
"No problem," said the frog. "No problem." And he handed Jack this raggedy scrap of material, like you might find in some dusty corner of your house. Well, Jack was kind of disappointed, but he didn't want to hurt the Frog King's feelings, so he said, "This is perfect. It's just perfect. Thank you so much." And he put the tablecloth in his backpack, climbed up the tunnel, ran home as fast as he could. Now, Jack's brothers had already returned, and they were so busy showing off their own tablecloths, they didn't even bother to say hi. But Jack's father, the king, gave him a great big hug, and he said, "I missed you so much, Jack. Did you bring something too?" "Well, I think I have something," said Jack, and he reached into his backpack, and he pulled out that crumpled up rag, and he laid it on the table, and the room went silent. You could hear people's hearts their hearts beating in their chests because the moment that it touched the table, it turned into the most amazing tablecloth with pictures of sparkling waterfalls and shimmering lakes and snow-covered mountains and tropical rainforest that made you feel like you were taking a vacation all the way around the world. The king couldn't take his eyes off of it. He said, "This is magnificent. It's magnificent. You've won the contest, Jack." Well, right away, the two older brothers, they started sulking around. Bill said, "That's not fair. I followed my feather all the way to the east and forced a little old lady to give me her nicest tablecloth." Tom said, "Yeah, it's not fair. I followed my feather to a big shopping mall in the west and spent a lot of money on my tablecloth. We won another contest." The king said, "Oh, all right, all right, all right, all right. We'll have another contest if you insist. This time, whoever brings back the most amazing, the most incredible pair of," what do you think?
Shoes.
Exactly. Good guess. Great guess. Yes. Yes. The most amazing pair of shoes in the whole wide world gets to be king. And don't forget, I want you back home in 1 year and 1 day. And then the king took his sons up to the roof again, reached down into his pocket again, pulled out 3 what?
Feathers.
Pure white magical feathers. He gave 1 feather to Bill, gave 1 feather to Tom, gave 1 feather to Jack. He said, "Go ahead, boys. Go ahead. Cast out your feathers. See what happens." So Bill threw out his feather. Whoosh! It flew away to the north. Tom threw out his feather. Whoosh! Flew away to the south. Jack threw out his feather. Whoosh! It fell into the backyard. The 2 older brothers said, "Hey, dummy, looks like you won't be going far." Then they stuffed their pockets with money, strapped on their weapons, and followed the feathers, one to the north, the other to the south, and Jack packed up enough peanut butter and jelly sandwiches to last a year, and he went out back to take care of the animals. Well, a year later, Jack was rescuing this little bird, little baby bird that had fallen out of its nest, when all of a sudden, that little frog hopped up to him, pulled on his jacket, said, "Hurry up, Jack. It's time to win the contest." Took him over to that big rock, knocked 3 times. Let's knock 3 times. Bam! The rock split wide open, and they dove into that long, long tunnel, down and down and down and down and down and down, till they got to the bottom, to that big room. And as soon as the frogs saw him, they jumped up and down and cheered, "Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray for Jack!" And then it got real quiet as the Frog King came into the room, sat down on his mushroom-shaped throne, and he said, "Welcome back, Jack. Welcome back. We were expecting you. What do you need for the contest?" "Well, I could use a pair of
Shoes.
"No problem," said the Frog King. "No problem." And he handed Jack this beat-up old pair of shoes like you might find out in the trash. Well, Jack was kind of disappointed again, but of course he didn't want to hurt the Frog King's feelings. So he said, "Why, these are just lovely. Thank you so much." He put them in his backpack, climbed up the tunnel, ran home. Of course, his brothers were already there, and they were so busy bragging about their own shoes, they didn't even say hi, but Jack's father gave him a hug, said, "Oh, I'm so glad to see you again, son. Did you bring something too?" "I think I have something," said Jack. He reached into his backpack, took out the shoes, held them up to the light, and this hush of silence fell over the room. You could hear people's hearts pounding like drums, because the moment that the light touched them, they turned into the most amazing pair of shoes. They had laces that could tie and untie themselves all by themselves. They could grow or shrink to fit any size foot, and when you put on the shoes, they gave you the power to travel forwards and backwards in time. The king was just hypnotized. He said, "Jack, these are out of this world. You've won the contest." Well, right away, Jack's brothers started whining and complaining again. They said, "That's not fair. That's not fair. People gave us their best shoes when they saw all our money and weapons. We want another contest. We want another contest." "Oh, for Pete's sake, stop your blubbering and whining," said the king. "We'll have one more contest only because this is a fairy tale, and things always come in threes in fairy tales. Now, can you make a prediction? What do you think the king's going to send his sons to get this time?" I'll give you 3 guesses because this is a fairy tale. What do you think the king's going to send his sons to get this time? What do you think? Maybe an amazing blanket. That's one guess. I need 2 more. Akili? An amazing book bag. The most amazing book bag in the whole world that could like fill itself or something or carry itself. One more guess.
Shirt.
Oh, the shirt of happiness. Maybe an amazing shirt. But here's what the king said. The king said, "This time, I want you to bring back a wife. After all, you'll need a woman. You'll need a woman with some common sense if you want to run the kingdom." Yeah, yeah. And yeah.
Obviously, yeah.
And by
Obviously, yes, you do.
and by the way, I expect you back home in
1 year and 1 day.
24 hours.
Oh.
Up they went to the roof. The king took out his last 3 magical feathers. He gave one to Bill, the big bully. He gave one to Tom, the big spender. And he gave one to Jack, the nature lover. Cast out your feathers, boys. Cast out your feathers and follow your destiny. Whoosh! Bill threw out his feather, and it traveled to the northwest. Whoosh! Tom threw out his feather, and it traveled to the southeast. Whoosh! Jack threw out his feather. Where did it land? In the backyard. Well, Jack's brothers laughed at him, called him dummy. Then they got ready to round up some wives. First of all, they scrubbed themselves. They took a big old bubble bath, scrubbed themselves really good and clean, shaved their royal beards, brushed their royal teeth, poured some deodorant under their royal armpits, got dressed up in their fancy clothes, strapped on their weapons, took the rest of the money out of the safe, jumped on their horses, and galloped away, one to the northwest, the other to the southeast. And Jack packed up some fish and chips and went out back to be with his animal friends. 23 hours later, that frog made his appearance. He pushed Jack. He said, Jack, your time's almost up. Pushed him over to the rock, knocked 3 times. Bam! Rock split open and they rolled all the way down to that underground room where the frogs were sitting breathlessly waiting for them. And as soon as Jack appeared, the frogs broke out in wild applause and they shouted, "Hip, hip, hooray! Hooray for Jack!" The Frog King was up on his throne and he said, "Oh, Jack. Oh, Jack. We were very worried about you, Jack. You've only got 15 minutes left. What do you need for the contest?" "I don't think you can help me this time," said Jack. Now, Jack, tell us what you need." "Well, I could use a wife." "No problem," said the Frog King. "No problem. Jack, my daughter's in love with you. She's just crazy about you. She keeps your picture in a little locket that she wears around her neck. Maybe you can learn to love her too. She's a very nice person. I mean frog." And sure enough, sitting on top of an identical mushroom-shaped throne was his daughter, the princess. And she was the spitting image of her dad, 4 feet wide, 6 feet tall, beautiful black spots and emerald green eyes. She winked at Jack and followed him up the tunnel. And when they got up to the top, Jack turned around to get a better look at her in the light of the human world. And guess what?
She turned into a woman.
She wasn't a frog anymore. She was just the friendliest, most cheerful young woman that you could ever imagine. And when they got to Jack's house, his brothers had beat him back again. And their wives were so mean and grumpy that everyone agreed that Jack had won the contest. One week later, there was a big celebration. The celebration lasted 3 days, 3 nights, 3 hours, 3 minutes, 3 half minutes, 3/4 minutes. And Jack, he turned out to be an awesome king because he took care of the natural environment and he treated everyone in the kingdom with respect. As a matter of fact, Jack opened up his house to the public every Sunday, rain or shine, free of charge, so the children could play with his animal friends. And since this is a fairy tale, you can be absolutely sure that they all lived
Happily ever after.
All right, thank you. What did you think of that story? That was a good story. All right, all right. I have to think of what story I'm going to tell next for a nice, intimate audience. Ooh. 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 Okay. Now, I'm big on audience participation, as you can see. So I've got to teach you your part in this story, in this next story. Are you ready to learn your part?
Yes. Ready.
Okay. Okay. I call this, you're going to help me sing what I call the catfish song. You all know what a catfish is? Yeah, they have really long whiskers. Yeah, yeah. Okay, so this is your part in the song. These are the words. 'Cause a catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah, a catfish wanna go home. I know it sounds weird, but you'll understand when the story begins. Okay, let's practice that. 'Cause a catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah. A catfish wanna go home. But you know what? We got to jazz it up a little bit with some. You can get up on your feet and dance, or you can move any way you want. Let's practice it with some moves, okay? 'Cause a catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah. Catfish wanna go home. Anyway, you can just make up your own moves. Okay. Crick.
Crack.
Crick.
Crack.
Crick.
Crack.
Once there was a boy named Simon, and he didn't want to go to school. His mom told him to go to school. His dad told him to go to school. All his teachers told him to go to school. Simon pretended to go to school. He would walk to school with his friends, but when they were halfway there, he would sneak away down the path all the way to the river. Now, right next to the river, there was a great big bush. And that's where Simon had hid his fishing pole. And he reached into the middle of the bush, took out that fishing pole, whoosh, cast the line in the water, and he'd go fishing all day long when his friends were in school, when they were stuck in school, and his mom and dad thought he was in school. Simon would be having the time of his life fishing in the river. Now, one day, Simon had his line out, and he was just fishing in the river, having a good old time, when all at once he got a bite. You know what happens when you get a bite? You have to reel it in, and he reeled it in, and that's right, help me reel it in. He reeled it in, he reeled it in, he reeled it in, he reeled it in, held up the line. Guess what he had caught? Catfish. Big old eyeballs, long whiskers, a slippery body that was flipping and flopping and wriggling and dancing around at the end of the line. And that catfish took one look at Simon, and this is what it said. Simon, oh Simon, take me home, Simon. Take me home, Simon. This is your part. 'Cause a catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah, catfish wanna go home. Simon couldn't believe it. He had a talking catfish on the end of his line, and it was bossing him around. Simon did not like to be bossed around. No, he did not like to be bossed around, and he never did what he was told, like go to school. But guess what? This was no ordinary fish. It was a magic catfish that had put a spell on Simon. So he had to do what the fish told him to do, whether he liked it or not. So he put the catfish in a basket, carried the basket back to the house. As soon as they got to the house, the catfish said, Simon, oh Simon, open the door, Simon. Open the door, Simon. 'Cause the catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah, catfish wanna go home. Oh, I wish that catfish would stop bossing me around. But he had to obey. So he opened the door, walked in his house. It was very, very quiet in his house because his parents, they had gone to work, so it was very quiet. But all of a sudden, the catfish started shaking the basket back and forth real loud. And he said, Simon, oh, Simon, take me to the kitchen, Simon. Take me to the kitchen, Simon. 'Cause the catfish wanna go home. Oh yeah, catfish wanna go home. If you say so, said Simon. carried the basket into the kitchen, the basket with the catfish in it, and as soon as they got there, the catfish jumped out of the basket, stood up on the table, spun around 2 or 3 times, and he said, "Simon, oh, Simon, cut me open, Simon. Cut me open, Simon." 'Cause the catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah, catfish want to go home. "Cut you open," said Simon. "Yeah. Cut you all the way open?" "Oh, yeah, oh, yeah, oh, yeah." So Simon once again did what the catfish told him to do. He got a knife. He sliced that catfish right down the middle. Took out his bones, took out his guts, took out his heart, his liver, peeled off his skin, and now he had a nice catfish fillet. Say that word, fillet. That's what you call a fish that's been prepared and is almost ready to eat. It was the most beautiful fillet with a nicely shaped head, including the eyes and the whiskers, and the prettiest little tail that you ever did see. And the catfish fillet said, "Simon, oh, Simon, what do you want now? Fry me in a pan, Simon. Fry me in a pan, Simon. 'Cause the catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah, catfish want to go home." Now, I already told you this was no ordinary catfish. It was a magic catfish that had put a powerful spell on Simon, so he had to obey. So he got ready to fry up that catfish. First, he spread all this flour out on the table, and then he rolled that catfish fillet around and around and around in the flour. He took a frying pan out of the cupboard, filled it with olive oil, put it on top of the stove, turned on the heat, and when that olive oil was just bubbling hot, Simon took that catfish, dropped him into the hot, hot oil, and fried him up. And when he was nice and crispy on one side, the catfish jumped up in the air, did a triple somersault, landed back in the oil, and fried himself up on the other side. Then he rolled his crispy eyeballs up at Simon, and he said, "Simon, oh, Simon, it's time to eat me, Simon. It's time to eat me, Simon. 'Cause the catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah, catfish want to go home." I'm sure you've already figured out that Simon did exactly what that bossy fish told him to do. He put the fish on a plate, got a fork, got a knife, and cut them up into little itty-bitty pieces. And then bit by bit and piece by piece, he started to eat them up. First, he ate the head with the eyeballs and the whiskers. And then bit by bit, piece by piece, he ate the whole middle part of the fish. And last of all, he stuck his fork in the tail and ate it up. And now, the plate was empty, and Simon was feeling pretty pleased of himself for having finally gotten rid of that fish, because he was sick and tired of being bossed around by a talking catfish. But all at once, he heard, "Simon,
How can he still
oh,
talk?
Simon, Take me to the river, Simon. Take me to the river, Simon. 'Cause the catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah. Catfish want to go home. Simon couldn't believe it. Now the fish was bossing him around from inside of his stomach. He ran out of the house, down the road, all the way to the river. As soon as they got to the river, the catfish said, Simon, oh, Simon, wade in the water, Simon. Wade in the water, Simon. 'Cause the catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah, catfish want to go home. And Simon obeyed. He walked right into the river, and the water got deeper and deeper, up to his knees, up to his stomach, up to his shoulders. And now you're never going to guess what happened next. As soon as the water got up to Simon's chin, the catfish jumped out of his mouth as if nothing was the matter. He still had all his insides. He had his outsides, his skin. He had his head, his eyeballs, his whiskers, his tail, as if he had never been cut up and cooked up and eaten up at all. And then that catfish, that talking catfish, dove into the water and swam away. And as he was swimming away, you could see this little tiny fin up above the surface of the river. He was making a little tiny ripple in the water, and if you listen very carefully, you could hear a little bubbly voice saying, Simon.
Seriously?
Oh, Simon, don't you ever cut school again. Simon, don't you ever cut school again. Simon, for catfish want to go home. Oh, yeah, catfish want to go home. And you know what? From that day on, Simon did exactly what that bossy catfish told him to do. He never missed a single day of school for the rest of his whole entire life. He got straight A's, too. And now I say, sat on a pin, the pin bent, and that's the way the story went. You say it. Sat on a pin, the pin bent, and that's the way the story went. Quieter. Sat on a pin, the pin bent, and that's the way the story went. All right. Thank you. I'm looking at the time. I don't know. Should I tell you one more?
Yes.
Just one more?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. Ooh.
Cowbell.
Ah. You think it's a cowbell. What kind of bell? Anyone else want to have a guess? It's called a singing bell.
Yeah, that's
Would you like to try to make it sing?
no.
Yeah?
What?
No?
No.
Okay. I got one more story for you. Very last story. Crick!
Crack.
Crick!
Crack.
Crick!
Crack.
Did you know that all of us, every one of us, are teachers? Every single person, you, and you, no matter how young, no matter how old, has something to teach another person. And once there was a girl. She lived, finally a story with a girl in it, huh?
Yes.
You've been waiting all afternoon for that,
Finally.
right? Finally.
Finally.
She lived with her mother and her father and her grandmother. They lived in a little house in a small village on a tiny island that was surrounded by the sea. The grandmother had lived a very, very long life. But as old as she was still a wonderful teacher. And every day she taught her granddaughter how to love and appreciate and respect the sea and all the living creatures of the sea. Every morning, just before dawn, before the sun came up, the girl would wake up her grandmother, and then hand in hand, they would follow the path down to the edge of the sea. And when they got to the shore, they would walk up and down the beach to see what the waves had left in the sand during the night. Sometimes they found pieces of driftwood that had been twisted by the waves into beautiful, mysterious shapes. Sometimes they found smooth, round stones that had been washed clean by the rising and the falling of the ocean's waves. Of course, they always found shells of every size, shape, and color. The girl's grandmother patiently taught her the name of every single shell and explained how the hard shells protected the soft bodies of the creatures that lived inside of them. If the girl was really, really lucky, she might find a starfish that the waves had carried from far out in the ocean to the shore, and grandmother had taught her how to tell if the starfish was still alive. You had to pick up the starfish very carefully, turn the starfish over, and then very gently try to bend the arms of the starfish. If the arms were flexible, if you could bend them, that meant that the starfish was still alive, and grandmother had taught her how to save the starfish's life by quickly throwing the starfish back into the ocean before the sun dried it up and it died. The girl always felt so happy and proud of herself when she had saved a starfish. You see, her grandmother had taught her that whenever there was an opportunity, she should try to save a life, even if it was just the life of a starfish. Every morning, just before dawn, before the sun came up, the girl would walk with her grandmother along the edge of the ocean to see what the waves had left in the sand. And then the girl turned 9 years old, and that year her grandmother had died. She had lived to be a very, very old woman, and it was her time. Earlier that day, that her grandmother had died earlier in the morning, the two of them had walked along the edge of the sea for the very last time. That morning, they had managed to save 5 starfish. And that night, after her grandmother had died, there was a terrible, terrible storm. Wow! The girl had lived through storms before, but she had never experienced a storm that was so big and powerful. The wind was so strong, the girl felt like it was going to pick up their little house and blow it out over the ocean. The thunderbolts were so loud, they sounded like giant hammers about to smash their village into 1,000 pieces. The girl's parents came into her room and held her in their arms in order to comfort her. And very gradually the storm died down, and the girl fell asleep. The girl woke up the next morning, just before dawn. She hurried up and got dressed, and she was about to wake up her grandmother, and then she remembered. Her grandmother had died the day before, and for the first time in her life, the girl went down to the edge of the sea all by herself, just before the sun came up. A large, full moon lit the path so she could see where she was stepping, even in the darkness. And as she approached the ocean, she saw hundreds, no more than that. There were thousands of starfish. It looked like all of the stars in the sky had fallen down upon the sand. She picked up one of the starfish, And at that moment, she remembered everything that her grandmother had taught her. Everything she had taught her. And so she turned the starfish over very carefully. She bent the starfish's arms very gently. They were soft and they were flexible. And so she threw it quickly into the ocean so that it could live. She picked up another starfish, turned it over, bent the arms. They were soft and flexible. So she threw it back into the ocean so that it could live. She picked up another starfish and another one and another one. Using both of her hands now, she started picking up the starfish as fast as she could and throwing them into the ocean, just as her grandmother had taught her to do. She felt so happy and so proud of herself. You see, not only was she saving starfish, but she felt like she was doing her own special dance with the wind and the waves and the starfish, a special dance to help keep the memory and the spirit of her grandmother alive. Now, a little while later, the sun came up, and all the other children in the village walked out to the beach to see what the storm had left in the sand. And when they saw that girl standing there, they formed a circle around her, and they started to laugh at her. They said, "What in the world are you doing? What are you doing? Don't you know? There are miles and miles and miles of beach. There are hundreds of starfish along every mile. You can't possibly save them all. There's way too many. You can't possibly make a difference. And besides, it doesn't matter." Well, the girl bent down and she picked up another starfish. It was a small starfish, and it fit right into the palm of her hand. And as she looked at that starfish, she thought about how her grandmother had taught her that every living thing was special and unique, and you should respect its life. And she said with confidence, "Yes, it does matter." And then with all of her strength and all of her might, she threw the starfish back into the ocean. And she said to the other children, "Well, at least I made a difference to that one." And then something completely unexpected happened. A little boy bent down, picked up a living starfish, threw it into the ocean, and he said, "And I made a difference to that one." And then a little girl picked up a starfish, threw it into the ocean, and said, "And I made a difference to that one." And then one by one, all the children did the same thing. They picked up those living starfish, threw them back into the ocean in order to save their lives. And a little bit later in the day, the grown-ups came out to the beach, and when they saw the children throwing those starfish back into the sea, they said, "What are you doing?" And the children said, "We're making a difference. Why don't you join us? You could make a difference too." You see, those children had become teachers, and they were teaching the grown-ups how to save lives. And the grown-ups, they were good students, and they listened to those children. And they too started throwing the living starfish back into the ocean. And now I'm going to tell you something that you might not believe. But by the end of the day, there were people stretched up the beach as far as the eye could see. Young people, old people, all ages. They were throwing those starfish back into the ocean. And if you went close enough, you could hear them say, "We can make a difference too." What did they say?
We can make a difference too.
And so can all of you. Thank you. Okay. Well, I want you to help me with a little chant to close up this storytelling program. So I'll teach you the words and then we'll say it together. Language is rhythm. Say that.
Language is rhythm,
And rhythm is language.
and rhythm is language.
Like music,
Like music,
like poetry,
like poetry,
like song.
like song.
One more time, let's practice. Language is rhythm, and rhythm is language, like music, like poetry, like song. Language is rhythm, and rhythm is language, like music, like poetry, like song. One more time. Language is rhythm, and rhythm is language, like music, like poetry, like song. Again. Language is rhythm, and rhythm is language, like music, like poetry, like song. And in the music, and in the poetry, and in the song, there is always the story. And that's the end. Thank you. Okay. Is that the end?
Do you take any questions?
Oh, sure. I take zillions of questions. I love questions. Yes. Hardballs.
So how did you become a storyteller?
Oh, wow.
And,
How did I become a storyteller?
Where did you learn your stories?
Oh, wow. Okay. How much time do you have? I guess I have to give you the short version. So I've always loved stories. I've loved to read stories. I've loved to hear stories. I've always loved stories, but I never thought of like being a storyteller. Like, who's a storyteller? There's doctors, there's lawyers, there's bricklayers, there's carpenters, there's teachers. How many storytellers are there? I never thought of it. And then one day, I actually met someone who was a storyteller. And I thought, wow, that's really awesome. It's awesome that I could be a storyteller. I could be a storyteller till I'm 115 years old, because you know, in the old days, it was really the old people in the communities who remembered all the stories and told them. I thought, wow, I never have to retire. So I made a decision to become a storyteller. So I already knew a lot of stories, but I really set about like learning a whole lot of stories for all ages, and happy stories, sad stories, funny stories, silly stories, ghost stories, fairy tales, myths, legends, every kind of story. And then I started going around to schools and festivals and theaters and parks and just every place you can imagine, and telling stories, but I still had my day job. But when I felt like I was ready, I kind of burnt my bridges and started telling stories full time and never looked back. That was about 30 years ago, yes. Yeah. Where do I learn my stories? Well, first of all, most of the stories I tell, I also do a program of what's called oral history, which are people's true life stories. That's another category of storytelling I do. Well, you have a question for me? Let me finish asking this question, okay, and then I'll answer your question. But the stories I tell that are like in the category of folklore, like mythology and legends and ghost stories, all those kind of stories, I read them in books, or I hear other people tell them, or that. But you know, I have to tell you something about why I'm in love with folk tales, because all of those kinds of stories, whether it's a fairy tale or a ghost story or a myth, they're really in the larger genre of folk tales. Now, what does tales mean? What does the word tales mean? It's another word for stories, right? And what does folk mean?
Everyday people.
People, just like us. Folk, yeah. So folk tales are really stories that belong to all the people. They're not like stories that are written by an author that's copyrighted. These are very, very old stories. You know, I tell people that folk tales are both old and new, because they're originated thousands and thousands of years ago. No one can even trace the real origins of them. So they're very old, but at the same time, every time someone tells a folk tale, they reinvent it. They make it new again. And I also tell people that folk tales are both true and not true. They're not true because they have a lot of magical things in them, like bossy catfish. Catfish who can talk even when they're turned into a fillet, but they always have some true lesson. The kernel of the story always has some kind of true lesson. Like, what was that true lesson in the fairy tale about about hip hip hooray, hooray for Jack. What was the lesson in that? Yeah.
That if you don't love nature, that you'll get punished.
Something like that. Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Something like that. Exactly. Exactly. So, oh, did you have another lesson? There's usually a lot of lessons.
Like, be generous and you'll be rewarded. Or be patient and you'll be rewarded.
Yeah. There's a lot of great lessons in that story, even though it's obviously like a fantastic story. But the whole thing, the thing I want to get across is that folktales belong to all of us. So that, like, if you felt like it, any of you felt like going home and telling the stories I told you to someone else, that's your right. That's your right. You'll just tell it in your own words, right? And you'll put your own personality into it. Okay. So I don't know. Did I answer that question? I don't remember if I went off on a tangent. Okay. Yeah.
If that second story was true, how would the catfish still be able to talk when it was eaten?
You're not supposed to ask those kind of questions with those kind of stories.
Fantastical.
Yes, yes.
Magical.
Magic, that's how.
Yeah.
Magical fish.
There's a term for that. It's called, this is a big term, but it's called the suspension of disbelief. Now, that means like you just have to put it out of your mind that you can't believe that's not true. You know, you just have to put that out of your mind.
I love that about fairy tales. You don't have to believe them.
Yeah, but you just get into them. They're enjoyable, and if you get into them, they'll teach you something. You know, and they'll stay with you longer than if someone just told you be nice or like nature. You know, stories kind of sink in and have a way of just living inside of you forever. I mean, I've told stories like 20 years ago, maybe to some school kids or somewhere, and I run into those kids like they're all grown up, you know, run into them like in the community, and I'll say, oh, I remember your story about such and such a thing about Simon and the Magic Catfish. Yeah, I remember that story. You know, stories just live with you for a real long time, a lot longer than just, you know, someone reads you a list of do's and don'ts. So, any other questions?
This isn't a question so much as just thinking about your question. Like, the other thing it does is that like in my imagination, I could follow it as though it were true.
Mm-hmm.
Like my imagination can do kind of anything. It could say, okay, I could imagine Simon in his stomach and talking and all that stuff. How did that happen? But my imagination could do it. That's another thing, I guess, that fairy tales do is they ponder.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we call the oral tradition. You know, stories that are just passed on by word of mouth is one of the things you have to do is you have to find a way to make really strong images so the people who are listening it can come alive in your imagination. And the neat thing is that each of you might have a different picture of what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of like a little duet, you know, a little collaboration between us. You know, it's I give you these kind of word pictures and then you use your imagination to kind of process that into. So it is really a collaborative process. It's the other, you know, books are wonderful. I adore books, but you basically read a book in private. You know, it's just a very private experience, whereas oral storytelling is a social experience. You know, you've got to have at least one storyteller and one listener, at least one. That's what I was telling them, you know, before when I wasn't sure if anyone was going to show up. Is I can't imagine telling stories without even at least one person to tell them to. You know. Yeah. Did you guys enjoy those stories?
Yes.
Oh, good. Okay.
You could feel us enjoy it.
Oh,
Like
good.
Sitting
good.
here, we were all.
Yeah, great. Yeah. Storytelling is a lot of fun. Yeah, I teach storytelling a lot in the schools also.
Great.
And you know, it's amazing how people who will first tell you, oh, there's no way I could tell a story. You know, there's no way, just become marvelous storytellers. You know, and they find their own voice and their way of kind of expressing a story in their own way. And so I go into a lot of schools and do what's called artist in residency programs, where you visit the the students over a long period of time, and I give them lessons in storytelling. And then at the end, we'll have like a little festival, and the kids will tell their stories, and it just will blow your mind how great they are. How, you know, we don't really. I think in our culture and our society right now, we don't encourage a lot of like developing confidence in, you know, in the verbal arts, and you know, because so much is like there's digital technology, or even, you know, the written text. There's not as much like oral storytelling, but in past cultures, you know, pretty much all around the world, in every culture, people were brilliant storytellers, because that's, you know, they really, that was their main form of expressing themselves, was orally, for much longer than we have the printed word, or obviously digital technology. So if you go, if you're lucky enough to still, you know, find some traditional cultures, people are just absolutely geniuses at telling stories. I mean, it's just you know, in the same way that, like, you guys could probably text really fast or do something, you know, something that just you do every day. You know, that. You're right. It's yeah.
I don't do muscles every day.
What's that?
I don't do muscles every day.
You don't do muscles. You don't do muscles. Do you do the imagination muscle? Do you imagine things? Yes, then you do that muscle. Good. Do you do the running around muscle? Yeah. Oh, I see. Oh, you see. There's a few muscles that you do.
How about the jumping?
Do you do the muscle where you don't always do what your parents tell you to do? Oh, that muscle, yeah.
Everybody has that one too.
Just like Simon, right?
Yeah. Oh, you're right. Well, thank you for stretching arms.